Okay, great. We'll just go ahead and get started. My name is Kelly Griga, and I am presenting on NAFTA Modernization on behalf of the Organization of Women in International Trade. It's a chapter in St. Louis specifically that is a new development in the region, and we're trying to start up a chapter here, local chapter that would be part of the international chapter. So the agenda for today is that first I wanted to go over the Organization of Women in International Trade, the trade association that is sponsoring today's presentation. Then we'll talk specifically about the NAFTA renegotiation, the timeline of what we can expect to happen in the future, and then we'll talk about these 4 industries and compare the industry goals that were expressed in the hearings given to the USTR and compare that to the printed goals that the USTR released at the end of last month. So we'll be able to compare these two as far as what the industry has gotten across to the USTR that they need to be incorporated into this new NAFTA. So first of all, the Organization for Women in International Trade is again, a trade association that has a mission statement to facilitate relationship building, provide educational development, and then partner in order to share in our mission of the economic empowerment of women. So it's pretty general, just that we want to focus on the advancement of women in the industry and then also foster networking and professional development. So this type of event is to foster professional development and to kind of get a better understanding of different trade topics that are out there. The organization was established in 1989. There are 24 different chapters and different all around the world. And this recently, St. Louis chapter is in development. We have a small group of women who want to start up this type of local networking event. We're going to be having some recruitment events, more of these professional development type webinars. We're looking for board members to help us bring this to light and help us to set up this local chapter, and then also looking for corporate sponsorship in order to pay for the fees to do so. So without that little commercial, we'll go ahead and talk about NAFTA. I wanted to talk a little bit about the timeline, what has happened already and what we expect to happen in the future. It's pretty confusing as far if you're not very familiar with congressional procedure and all of that. So what has happened already is captured in this particular timeline, where we have President Trump being his inauguration was in January, so the fact that he ran on the platform of scrapping NAFTA or renegotiating NAFTA, it basically set all of this in motion. Then we saw the notification letter to Congress where the administration notify Congress that they will be starting to renegotiate the NAFTA terms, and that had to happen 90 days before negotiations begin. And in between that notification and the 90 days later when negotiations began last week, the USTR requested comments from industry in order to get their input as to what should be renegotiated. And then after the submission of comments, of written comments, then the hearings occurred in Washington, D.C., where the USTR sat down for 3 days and listened to over 140 people testifying for their particular type of industry. So it was a long, grueling process for them, but they did get to hear good differing input on the different topics that they need to hear for, how to negotiate the new NAFTA. Moving forward, the administration has projected that they would like to complete negotiations by the beginning of 2018, and that is primarily because of the, well, my guess is that is primarily because of Mexico's presidential elections, and they didn't want to politicize this particular renegotiation with dealing with the elections in Mexico, because it could get very political. And so what they would like to do is complete negotiations by 2018 so that it doesn't come to that. However, I'm not very optimistic that the negotiations would be completed by 2018, because there have been studies that in the past, negotiation with the United States takes at least a year and a half. If you look at all of the other FTAs that we've negotiated, it takes a year and a half, and they're wanting to get it done within a few months. So moving forward, the next timeline that I wanted to go over was assuming that, when the negotiations started last week, assuming that, we get through all the negotiations, we establish what Canada wants changed, what Mexico wants changed, assuming we agree, and according to the administration, that agreement will happen on January 2018. But whenever that happens, after negotiations are complete, what has to happen next is that the administration has to submit a report to the congressional committees on the changes to U.S. trade law. So if we agree to something, if President Trump agrees to something in these U.S. negotiations, in these NAFTA negotiations, if that contradicts current U.S. law, then he has to let Congress know that he's agreed to change domestic law. So that has to happen 180 days before Trump actually signs NAFTA. So he has a deadline. Even if negotiations ended on January 1st, 2018, he has another 180 days before he can sign NAFTA, because he has to make changes to U.S. trade law and let Congress know. So in addition to that, 90 days later, Trump has to notify Congress about his intent to sign the deal. And then 30 days after that, Trump's team has to publish the text on the website of the USTR. So this all has to do with notification, and it has to do, all of these deadlines are in the TPA Act that the administration must follow. So then if he was able to check all of those boxes and actually does sign NAFTA, then 90 days after signing, the administration must provide a public description of the changes to U.S. laws. And then 30 days after that, the administration must provide a description of U.S. laws in order to bring into compliance with the deal. So any of those notifications have to happen within 90 days and then 30 days after that. And then another timeline, I swear this is the last timeline, but just wanted to get a good overview of what actually has to happen. So even after Trump signs NAFTA, then there are different tasks that he has to notify, and he has to submit these changes to U.S. law and the renegotiated NAFTA to Congress. And then there's 180 days where then the House Ways Committee has to report the bill, then the House of Representatives must vote, then the Senate Finance Committee reports on the bill, and then the Senate votes on the trade deal. So this can be drawn out. This is why it takes a year and a half to negotiate and get it to actually occur. So even if the president today said, this is what we agreed to renegotiate, there's still at least 200 legislative days that have to happen before they can actually make this new NAFTA product effective for the industry. So I don't have any hope that this is going to move quickly, because in addition to these days, they're legislative days. They are days that Congress is in session. And if you have any familiarity with Congress, you know that they're not always in session. They go back to their home states for 2 weeks at a time. I think they have a really long break over summer. So these are not just regular business days, these are legislative days. So that will draw it out even longer. So with that, so now you have a good understanding of how exactly the free trade agreement might come into fruition. Let's talk a little bit about what each organization or which industry, what they would want in a renegotiated NAFTA. And I do have summaries from a couple different industries, and I'll continue to do this type of analysis. And maybe in future presentations we can talk about additional industries if that's of interest to our members. The first industry is textile. So the textile industry had many different witnesses in front of the USTR. It seemed like there were many lobbyists in order to discuss the textile industry. They have a very large interest in NAFTA. They made it very clear in their testimonies that NAFTA has had a positive impact on many of the supply chains within the textile industry. And some of the goals that they stated that they would like to see in a renegotiated NAFTA include intellectual property protections. So the written comments that we saw from different panelists, they argue that the Mexico intellectual property laws are applied inconsistently, and that the Canadian intellectual property system, quote, remains confusing more than a year after implementation. So the textile industry, they're complaining about intellectual property in our NAFTA party countries, not being, they can't follow them, they don't really understand them, and that is reflected in the USTR goals, because they, the USTR printed that they would like to see Mexico and Canada reflect a standard of protection similar to that found in US law. So the USTR and the industry is in agreement that the intellectual property protections that are found in the US, they would like Canada and Mexico to kind of be up to that standard. I would like to say that US has one of the highest standards of intellectual property protections, and the textile industry is stating that Mexico and Canada just aren't up to our standards. The next goal that the textile listed in their written comments and oral testimony was a focus on the Buy American Act, Buy American laws. And those include the Berry Amendment and the Kissel Amendment. And the textile industry is very focused on those two amendments to the Buy American laws. They're not really amendments, they're just laws, but that's what colloquially, that's what they're called, the Berry Amendment and Kissel Amendment. They're laws that require the Department of Defense to purchase only domestic products for certain military and non-military purposes. Now, the textile industry is interested in this because of all of the uniforms that the Department of Defense buys. So this is a $1 billion contract that the textile industry can get, and it doesn't go outside of the country. So they're very concerned about that cash flow, about that business that they get from the Department of Defense. The USTR stated that they would like to, quote, keep key Department of Defense procurement programs. And so presumably that means the Berry Amendment and the Kissel Amendment. So the USTR does have a goal of keeping those procurement programs, so that will satisfy the textile industry. One other comment about the Berry Amendment and the Kissel Amendment is that there's actually kind of a loophole in these programs, and it has to do with some procedure that wasn't completed correctly under NAFTA. So I'm going to try to explain it, and please stop me if you have any questions. But the TSA administration, the Transportation Security Administration, was created after NAFTA. And under the text of NAFTA, the U.S. should have advised NAFTA parties of its intention to exempt the TSA from NAFTA government provision text. And because they failed to do that, they didn't follow the rules of NAFTA for this new administration they created after 1994. The government provision chapters of NAFTA allow the U.S. government this loophole that allow the U.S. government to buy TSA uniforms from U.S., Mexico, and Canada, while every other administration, every other organization under the Department of Defense has to buy U.S.-made material. The TSA, under this provision in NAFTA, doesn't have to. And the textile industry is pretty upset about that. The one panelist valued this type of loophole at $24 million in business that could go to foreign manufacturers. So they're wanting to close that loophole, but that isn't something that the USTR noted in their goals. But it's just an interesting fact of the Berry Amendment and the Kissel Amendment that the textile industry noted in their request to renegotiate NAFTA. So those are the two that the USTR agreed with, and the USTR did specifically include those goals in their printed goals. But the textile industry had a few other goals that weren't listed with the USTR, and that is to amend or keep the yarn forward rule. So depending on where the panelists were in the supply chain, they were divided as to whether the yarn forward rule is good or not. And basically the yarn forward rule is a rule of origin stating that it's just kind of a short way of saying the rule of origin. The rule of origin states that the yarn used in production has to originate in a NAFTA country. So the fibers that create the yarn can be imported. So the parties that create yarn have the ability to source from foreign manufacturers, but still say that their product is made in the USA and qualifies for NAFTA. However, if you move up the supply chain and you have someone creating fabric from that yarn, they are not allowed to source yarn outside of the U.S. if they want to continue getting NAFTA preference. So as you move along the supply chain, people have different opinions of this yarn forward rule because sometimes it prohibits importation for some people on the supply chain and it allows it for other people. So it wasn't listed on the USTR goals, so I don't think the USTR has taken a stance on it. But the yarn forward rule is definitely something that people were divided on. And then the other point that the panelists were divided on is the tariff preference levels. And what this does is it's basically another loophole where the fabric manufacturers are allowed to bring in a certain level of foreign material, and it's kind of appeasing those fabric manufacturers that don't like the yarn forward rule. Well, we'll give you this tariff preference level and kind of ease your pain here. If you can't find the yarn that you're looking for in the U.S., you are allowed to go buy it from China, and we'll still give you the NAFTA preference. So everyone who is against TPLs looks at it like a loophole, and we're giving China benefits under NAFTA that they shouldn't be given, and that kind of thing. So again, it depends on where the party is on the supply chain as to whether they benefit from it or they are harmed by it. So the USTR has to balance these kind of debates and balance these kinds of helpfulness of a particular rule, and then, if a particular rule harms it. So it's very much something that the USTR has to weigh. And along the same lines, the textile industry requested that they improve short supply and availability provisions. So this is, again, another loophole to the Yarn Forward rule, in that the fabric producers, if they can prove to customs, or they can prove that there's a short supply of a particular product, you can have some sort of loophole and you're able to go purchase it from outside of the region, bring it in, and then still get NAFTA preference. So again, it's another loophole, and there were parties saying that, this is a requirement in order to keep our supply chains going. We have to have this kind of short supply availability. And they also referenced the short supply provisions within the TPP. So there was some provisions in the TPP that the textile industry really did agree with, and they're trying to bring that back into the renegotiated NAFTA. And we'll see that as a reoccurring theme, that a lot of these lobbyists really did like some aspects of the TPP, and they do always refer back to some of those provisions while we're not going to have the TPP in the U.S., they want to pull those provisions out of TPP and plug them right into the new NAFTA. So we'll see some more examples of that as we go through the other industries. And then finally, the textile industry wanted to update duty drawback. There are some exceptions to the availability of duty drawback for the textile industry, and they're wanting to simplify it and allow the industry to take more advantage of that provision. And then streamline de minimis rules. Apparently, the de minimis rules for Canada and Mexico and the U.S. are different. So I was going to do a little bit more research on that, because that was news to me, that we could have different de minimis rules within the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. So that is something that the textile industry brought up to be more competitive. They want to make sure that each country is on the same playing field. So the next industry would be the agriculture industry, and by far it was the agriculture industry that had so many panelists, so many people testifying, probably because it's so diverse, and there were different requests for different industries. So each industry had a different request for NAFTA, and so maybe that's why more people wanted to talk about agricultural requests and renegotiation of NAFTA than any other industry. But agriculture was definitely the most discussed industry in the 3 days of hearings. So again, we have on the left-hand side, we have the USTR goals that the agriculture industry is advocating for, and then the agriculture industry has some goals that maybe the USTR hasn't listed in their goals. So first, the USTR recognized the importance of updating the sanitary and phytosanitary provisions. In the testimony for the agricultural industry, a lot of panelists mentioned that the TPP has a great article on the sanitary and phytosanitary provisions, SPS provisions. So a lot of people were a proponent of pulling the SPS chapter from TPP and plugging it into the new NAFTA. So basically, sanitary and phytosanitary provisions are the scientific justifications for stopping food at the border. So if it's not, if it has maybe pesticides that aren't allowed in the country, or if they're worried about food safety, or they tested for contaminants and it tested positive, the complaints of the agricultural industry on many fronts, many different types of agricultural component aspects of the agricultural industry, many different types of crops have the same complaint that Canada and Mexico unnecessarily stop their products at the border for different sanitary reasons, and they never have enough transparency to be able to defend against that. And so with their crops being sensitive and perishable, they really suffer a lot when there's delays at the border. So the agricultural industry asked for transparency and scientific justification for stopping food at the border. And the USTR agreed and listed as a goal to establish a mechanism to resolve expeditiously unwarranted barriers that block the export of U.S. food and agricultural products. So the USTR recognizes that this might be a big issue for the agricultural industry, and they definitely put it on their list of goals to address with Canada and Mexico. So we'll see some discussions about that for sure. The second goal is to modify enforcement process for seasonal quotas and tariffs. The seasonal and perishable products like produce like tomatoes and the citrus from Florida, the representatives from those industries had a really big problem with the enforcement process for quotas and tariffs and the anti-dumping and countervailing duties investigations for their products, because tomatoes and oranges and lemons are so perishable that they were complaining that Mexico and Canada were putting these unnecessarily difficult barriers in order to get market access for their products. And additionally, because of the way that anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations work, the perishable food industry never really, they said, they never really found in their favor, because the investigations average the entire market over the year. Now, when you're talking about seasonal products, maybe they only get shipped in June or July, you know, strawberries, blueberries, that kind of thing, apples in September. When the anti-dumping and countervailing investigations average the industry over the entire year, they don't find enough damage in order to make some sort of adjustment to the market and prevent this blocking at the border. So what these types of growers asked for was a modifications to the investigations and the ability to look at seasonal instead of over the entire market over the entire year. And the USTR agreed, because they listed on their goals seek a separate domestic industry provision for perishable and seasonal products in anti-dumping and countervailing proceedings. So they heard that loud and clear, and they put it specifically in their list of goals for perishable and seasonal products. And then the next point was geographical indicators. So a geographical indicator is labeling or naming of products according to where it was produced. So the example is champagne can only be produced in one area of the world in order for you to call it champagne. Otherwise, it's sparkling wine, or if it's made in Spain, it's called cava. So those are geographical indicators, in that you can only sell champagne. I think the other example is like bourbon, right? You can only call it bourbon if it's created in a certain geographical area. So the EU is pushing these regulations specifically to increase its cheese across the globe, and what they would want to see is only allowing cheese to be called Parmesan, Feta, or Asiago if it's produced in certain regions. And the U.S. is very opposed to that because obviously there are U.S. producers that make Parmesan cheese, Feta cheese, or Asiago cheese, if they had to change the name of their product, I feel like that would, they feel like that would greatly reduce their market access. So the dairy producers definitely want to prevent the improper use of geographical indicators. They do concede that there is use for geographical indicators, just not as restrictive as the EU would want. And they're mentioning it in the NAFTA renegotiation because they would like it to be part of all future free trade agreements. So while it's a concern with the EU, maybe not so much of a concern with Canada and Mexico, they want it put in this free trade agreement just for future reference. So they acknowledge that, you know, there's really no concern right now with Canada and Mexico for geographical indicators. The concern really is with the EU, but moving forward, they want geographical indicators established as they don't want it to impose unneeded restrictions on future FTAs. And then the last goal that the USTR agreed with, as far as agriculture is concerned, is the intellectual property request. So the agricultural industry included pesticides as part of the agricultural industry. They might be their own industry altogether because they have different goals than the actual growers of produce. But the pesticides industry was worried about data protection. And I imagine companies like Monsanto selling their seeds are also worried about data protection as well. They would like NAFTA to bring the parties in line with WTO obligations and then also with TRIPS, the most recent IP international agreement, TRIPS. And the U.S., they're wanting the U.S. IP standards to be basically exported to Canada and Mexico. They want Canada and Mexico to do what the U.S. is doing. And the U.S. grants 10 years of data protection for properly registered information. And Mexico only offers 5 years of protection. And they only support 5 years of protection for registration of pesticide products. So that's why the pesticide industry, the people who make pesticides, want this 10-year protection that they have in the U.S. They want that 10-year protection in Mexico as well. So other things that we heard in the agricultural testimony that maybe aren't included in the USTR goals include a rapid response mechanism. That has to do with the sanitary and phytosanitary provisions. This rapid response mechanism was found in the TPP, and what it does is enhances the implementation and enforcement of sanitary and phytosanitary provisions. It is a process to immediately provide notification to the importer or exporter of record if their products are stopped at the border for any particular reason. And this goes to the perishable nature of agricultural products. They would like to know exactly the moment it gets stopped at the border so they can start resolving it and their tomatoes don't start rotting. The second point of the rapid response mechanism is that there's an expedited review at the request of the importer or exporter of record. So they don't want them dragging their feet as to why their products are stopped at the border. They want an answer now so that they can fix whatever needs to be fixed and the tomatoes can move along their way. The rapid response mechanism, like I said, was a provision in the TPP, and the TPP required notification in 7 days and then mandates that expedited review process within 15 days. So that is a very specific stipulation. Now, in the hearings, Randy Gordon, the president of the National Grain and Feed Association, suggested that the notification standard should be even shortened to be 3 days rather than the 7 days that was found in the TPP. So they're making some broad or not broad, they're making very specific demands on these sanitary and phytosanitary provisions in order to improve the border crossings for their perishable products. Very specific things that they would like to see in NAFTA. And the other points that we didn't find in the USTR goals are very specific to certain industries. So I would imagine if the USTR is trying to do, a broad list of goals, I would guess that they wouldn't include these very specific goals that the beef industry has, that the corn industry has, organics and sugar. So these are specific goals to specific industries. So we saw the cattle industry and the beef producers, they are concerned about the country of origin labeling. They call it COOL, the acronym COOL, country of origin labeling. The panelists were divided. So there were some people within the supply chain, the cattle industry, that were against the country of origin labeling. And then there were some panelists who said that the country of origin labeling was a good thing. The consumer protection lobbyists seem to be a proponent of the country of origin labeling because it allows consumers to properly purchase, to know what they're buying and to understand that, they are buying American beef. And also, these lobbyists want the cattle industry, the people who raise the cattle, to get a fair price for their product if they are spending the extra money to raise their cattle in the U.S., assuming that, it's more expensive to do so. So if they can label their product as U.S. beef, then they can demand a higher price for it, because consumers would think that that was a higher quality product. The COOL regulations, the country of origin labeling, was actually determined to be a violation of WTO regulations. So the U.S. has already gone to court over the country of origin labeling, and the WTO says that we can't do it. So a lot of the people who were against the country of origin labeling basically said that. The WTO said we can't do it. If we start doing it again, if we start trying to require labeling, Mexico and Canada are going to sanction us. They're going, well, not sanction us, but they're going to have retaliatory measures and be able to fine us against the WTO decision. On behalf of the small farmers, Betsy Gerald from the National Family Farm Coalition suggested that the U.S. should request Canada and Mexico to withdraw their COOL, their country of origin labeling, complaint under the WTO. She's even going as far as forcing Canada and Mexico to go to the WTO and say, oh, our bad, no, we're going to let them do that. Even though the WTO found that it was a violation, and this Ms. Gerald from the National Family Farm Coalition would want Canada and Mexico to withdraw any action to implement the WTO award. So I feel like that is something that is probably not going to happen, but it will be interesting to see what discussions come along from the country of origin labeling, specific to the beef industry, but also in general for the rest of the industries. Another goal for the corn and wheat industry was to update the unfair grain grading procedure in Canada. So when wheat and corn growers send their products up to Canada, they were complaining that the Canadian grain rating is unfair because all foreign grain going into Canada is rated as feed grain, causing it to fetch the lowest price on the market. So even if it's not feed grain, if it is a higher grade in the U.S., Canada considers all foreign grain to be the lowest quality. And so the U.S. grain producers can't sell at a higher price. They have to sell at the lowest price, even though it may be a high-quality grain. So the corn and wheat producers definitely want that updated. They call it an unfair barrier to trade for them getting market access into Canada. And again, that's a very specific part of the agriculture industry, something that maybe the USTR may not get into just yet. There was some testimony from the organics industry, the Organics Trade Association, and they made a mention of incorporating organic equivalency arrangements into the new NAFTA. And what that means is organic equivalency arrangements means that as long as products meet the agreed to standards, the organics may be labeled and sold as organic in the agreeing countries, in the countries that are party to this agreement. So the U.S. has an agreement with the EU right now as far as organics are concerned. So if you're able to label your product as organic in the U.S., you can do so in the EU if you export there. The U.S. also has an agreement with Canada where we can sell our organic labeled products there, but not with Mexico. So the Organics Trade Association would like to keep the arrangement with Canada, but then allow for direct negotiation with Mexico as far as organic equivalency arrangements. These types of arrangements aren't always found in FTAs. They are sometimes separate agreements. So they aren't opposed to having it incorporated into the new NAFTA, but they are wanting to have it acknowledged that it's an important thing for their particular industry. And finally, the last goal in the agriculture sector is for sugar. There are quotas for sugar. Bringing into the United States, only a certain level of product is eligible for duty-free treatment under NAFTA. And so once that particular level is reached, nothing can come in duty-free and everything is taxed. The interesting thing was that these panelists said that there wasn't enough sugar coming into the U.S. to satisfy the demand. And I immediately was thinking, oh, yes, we have a very high demand for sugar because we're all obese and overweight. We're eating way too much sugar, so maybe we should keep those quotas, right? But as far as the industry is concerned and the supply chain and filling the demand that's there, I mean, we can't stop the demand. We just need to be more adamant about eating healthy. But the confectioners, manufacturers really think that it really prohibits them from creating enough product to fill demand in the market. So the market is not operating efficiently, they're saying. So they would want the quotas to be increased. They want more sugar to be coming into the United States duty-free. And they also have what is called a cumulative access provision. And that is a provision found in the TPP that they want applied to the new NAFTA, and it allows for additional access to sugar coming from Canada. So they want this TPP provision added into the new NAFTA to import more from Canada. Apparently, the current quotas restrict a lot of sugar coming from Canada. Phew. Okay, so that was a lot. The last two I'll probably go through pretty quickly. The last two are the automotive industry and the oil and gas industry. There aren't as many points on this slide because the automotive industry really didn't have that many people testifying as far as what the new NAFTA should look like, which is surprising to me because the automotive industry benefits so much from NAFTA. They spent a lot of their time, the people who did testify spent a lot of their time arguing about keeping the rules as is, you know, stressing the fact that the industry promotes so many jobs within the U.S., and, you know, they currently are functioning with a seamless supply chain across borders, and, you know, please don't disrupt that kind of thing. So they definitely spend a lot of time asking for that first point of keeping the rules of origin as is. The USTR really didn't address specific rule of origin requests. There weren't any, you know, specific goals under the USTR as far as, you know, we're going to increase automotive rules of origin or decrease them or that kind of thing. They really didn't get into that much detail. But the USTR did acknowledge the two goals of the automotive industry that are incorporating cross-border data flows and preventing currency manipulation. So these two goals listed under the USTR, the automotive industry was a proponent for, and basically cross-border data is the government's ability to collect digital traffic, so digital information, emails, and personal data possibly moving across borders. So the automotive industry was one of the industries that mentioned this type of goal to incorporate the cross-border data flows into the new NAFTA. And what the industry was asking for was explicit exceptions to the cross-border data flows in order to reduce uncertainty for businesses and ensure that governments form an adequate justification for any data flow restrictions that are imposed. So they just want it written out that the government can do this and they cannot do this, so that the industry can set up its supply chain without fear of, you know, all of a sudden getting roadblocks from a particular agreement. So they didn't necessarily say any specific examples of how they were harmed by this. They just want to know, you know, what exactly are the rules of the game so that they don't get any surprises. The currency manipulation is something that the automotive industry is specifically concerned about, and it was one of the biggest things that that they liked about the TPP, or that they didn't like about the TPP, because the TPP did not place Japan as a currency manipulator. They're very this type of industry is very concerned about Japan and having the ability to change the exchange rate in order to make its products cheaper, and then unnecessarily compete with U.S. products. So the automotive industry is mad at Japan for doing this and kind of biting into their market share. And so they want this type of manipulation prevention to be put into the new NAFTA, even though they admit wholeheartedly during their testimony that Canada and Mexico have never tried to manipulate their currency in order to affect the market access of the different regions. But they still want it put into the new NAFTA because they want it to be in future FTAs. So they want the new NAFTA to be a template for all future FTAs, including something with Japan. So they did state that Japan was their main focus here when they're talking about currency manipulation. We already talked about the automotive goal of keeping the rules as is. They also have a goal of recognition of U.S. safety standards. So they would want the safety standards in the U.S. to be, again, met in Canada and Mexico and in future FTAs. So they really have a complaint against the EU right now because the EU and the U.S. safety standards are different. And so automotive manufacturers have to make a different car for the EU and a different card for the U.S., and what they could do is manufacture one version of each vehicle and conform to the regulatory regime and not have to have two different product lines. It will save them money, it will make their cars cheaper, that kind of thing. The president of the American Automotive Policy Council testified that recognizing U.S. safety standard in future FTAs would help counter the trend of EU goods being favored over U.S. goods. So he's saying because of these different standards, people are buying EU products and not U.S. products. But that's a whole other debate as to why they're preferring EU standards over U.S. standards. Maybe we need to look at our standards too. They're wanting to have more unification with EU, and I think that will be an ongoing conversation with, maybe not with the new NAFTA, but ongoing conversations with all future FTAs. And then finally, with automotive, they want to regulate e-commerce. The automotive industry is getting into shipping parts across borders online, and they see that as a very important product line for them moving forward. And so they want to know the rules of the game. And because NAFTA was in force in 1994, before the internet was even a thing, there's really no e-commerce provisions like there is in future FTAs that have been negotiated more recently. And finally, the oil and gas industry, not a whole lot of testimony, not a whole lot of written comments either, but they did have some interesting topics. The oil and gas industry really depends on the investor-state dispute chapters of NAFTA, specifically the Chapter 19. Oh, no, oil and gas really depends on Chapter 11, which is the litigation over the treatment of foreign investment. There's also Chapter 19, which is also called ISDS, Investor-State Dispute, and there's a Chapter 20. So there's 3 different chapters in NAFTA that can be called ISDS provisions. The oil and gas industry depends on Chapter 11 because it is what would have prevented, if you remember, in was it Venezuela or Argentina, where the government basically said, all products in our country are now owned by the government. And so all U.S. companies that had products there had drilling material and mechanical equipment, they lost all of it. And so this type of industry is very, very concerned about the foreign investment protections that free trade agreements give. So that's Chapter 11. Chapter 19 is the appeals of the anti-dumping and countervailing decisions, and that is what the USTR has stated that they want to eliminate. So oil and gas and USTR aren't necessarily at odds with the ISDS topic. One likes Chapter 11, and the USTR wants to get rid of Chapter 19. So just to be specific, if you hear about ISDS provisions, just make sure you know which chapter they're referring to in the agreement. And then, again, intellectual property, bring NAFTA in line with WTO obligations and trips. So we've been hearing that from a bunch of different industries just to make sure that they're protected with their copyright laws and other IP provisions. The oil and gas industry testimony had some interesting aspects to it because there was actually a debate over export restrictions. There were some parties, the parties actually didn't want us to export any of our natural gas because they were seeing a shortage in the future, whereas the American Petroleum Institute was saying that we're going to be self-sufficient with our natural gas by 2020. So it was very confusing as to who was actually correct in our future state of natural gas production. But there definitely was debate within the few people who were testifying in front of the USTR. This industry also wants to get rid of duty drawback restrictions, just like the textile industry. They want to be able to re-export products and get their duties back as a refund. And this industry was the most interesting because they actually had specific suggestions to change the rule of origin. They actually talked about how they qualify their products for NAFTA and how the specific product rule affects their day-to-day operations. No other industry really got into that much detail about the rule of origin. The automotive industry just said, we like it the way it is, don't change it. But oil and gas, specifically natural gas and lubricants, wanted to actually change their rule of origin. Specifically, the American Petroleum Institute was talking about how they have to dilute their product in order for it to transfer along the pipeline. So they have to add this additive to their product to be able to get it from one place to the other. And adding that product causes it to not qualify for NAFTA. So they're concerned about that it's not really adding to the value of the product, it's just a way for them to get it from one place to the other. And it removes that eligibility for preferential treatment under NAFTA. So they're wanting the rule of origin to make an exception for maybe this diluting material that they use. They didn't say exactly what it was, but they wanted that exception put into their rule. And then Valvoline apparently has a 25% threshold of non-originating materials. So in their calculation for NAFTA preference, they have to have 75% of U.S., Mexico, or Canadian content, and only 25% can be foreign material. They are asking that the level be 50%. So they're wanting to be able to have 50% of foreign material in their products and only have to have 50% of their products be from U.S., Canada, or Mexico. So they're asking for it to be easier to qualify for NAFTA provisions. And that was basically the only industry that I heard state a specific rule of origin change. So interesting stuff. Anyways, I know that was a lot of information, and thanks for attending today. If you have any questions, we have a few minutes. If not, you can go ahead and log off and have a wonderful day, a wonderful rest of your day, and be on the lookout for more OWIT St. Louis announcements. We'd like to invite all of you to our recruiting events and future networking events, along with some of our mentoring and training that we want to do in the future. So like us on LinkedIn, and you'll see all of our announcements. We have a website that you can subscribe to, as well as follow us on Twitter if you tweet. So again, thank you very much, and you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Kelly. I just have a quick question. This is Ida Rose.
Sure.
Thank you. What is your website?
Oh, okay. You can find it on our LinkedIn page, but let me pull it up. So as we are trying to get our chapter up off of the ground, I just created a free website here.
Okay.
And it is it's my name, kellygriga.wixsite.com, OWIT STL. Wixsite. And follow us on LinkedIn, because I put all of our announcements on there. I use LinkedIn a lot more than our website here.
Okay.
So definitely follow us, and we'll keep you posted on all of our organizational events.
That sounds great. So I'll follow it through LinkedIn, and I look forward to getting more information from you. I provided my email, so thank you so much. Very good information, and I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Take care. We'll be in touch.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.